Praise be Jesus Christ, now and forever. Apologies for failing to produce a nugget last week. Next time I'm on my travels, I'll ask a 5-year-old to help me with computer glitches. I'm not that computer adept, I'm afraid. But this time I have my trusty microphone back with me. We can all have a rather romantic view, and perhaps naive view, of life in the early church. When one reads in the Acts of the Apostles of the life sharing everything and united in prayer, we hearken back wishing we could live in that golden age. It's true, of course, that there was a fervour and fidelity which we should always hope to imitate, but it's also very clear in reading the scriptures, particularly the Acts of the Apostles and the letters of St. Paul, that division and disharmony were also features of the life of the early church, almost from the very beginning. That ought not to surprise us and certainly not disappoint us, unless, as I said, we have a rather naive view of living the Christian life. Sin doesn't disappear when people come to Christ, which is why, as I said recently, we need constant forgiveness. The fact that we continue to fail and fall is not the issue. The question this week to consider is, how do we who claim the name of Christian deal with that division and disharmony when it appears, without either being so lax that important issues are not resolved in the name of peacekeeping, or so rigid, a popular word these days, that we cannot restore peace. The issues that faced the early Christian communities were in some ways very different from our day, but also sometimes strikingly familiar. Doctrinal disputes weigh heavily in the writings of St. Paul, but also problems with morality in the life of the community and how to deal with the member who has fallen. As you know, I've been reading for some time the biography of St. Paul by the great biblical scholar Tom Wright. It's a really excellent book. Unfortunately, these days I read incredibly slowly. I'm lucky if I can finish one book a year. Probably having about 20 of them on the go at the same time is part of the problem. Wright points out about a quarter of the way into the book a terrible dispute, a real bust-up we could call it, between Paul and Barnabas, his great friend and fellow worker in preaching the gospel. If you remember from your reading of Acts, the fallout occurs because Paul will not let John Mark, the cousin of Barnabas and the author of the Gospel of Mark, come back on a missionary trip with them. This was because, in Paul's view, John Mark had let them down before when he'd abandoned them on an earlier missionary trip. Wright makes the point that if both men had been a little more forgiving, a little more open to discussion, the problem could have been resolved. However, it seems both were rather hot-headed and tempers flared. Wright says that St. Luke, the author of the Acts of the Apostles, uses a Greek word, paroxymos, which means a bitter, blazing row. I actually find that strangely encouraging, that these men who we rightly consider saints, great saints, were as weak and fallible as we are. The fact that at least for some time this dispute was not resolved is a sign of the need for humility and charity, and once again, forgiveness. The key point that Wright makes, which is, I think, our great lesson for imitation, is that later in Paul's letters, when he talks about avoiding angry and bitter words, he's clearly preaching to himself, which is actually essential for every preacher. That the dispute was healed, we know, because John Mark eventually became one of Paul's closest companions. So the lesson for us 2,000 years later is not to fear the argument or the division, but never to let, as St. Paul wrote, the sun go down on our anger. Making up may be hard to do, but it's essential for the life of the Christian. Brethren, rejoice, be perfected, be comforted, be of the same mind, be at peace, and the God of peace and love will be with you.